watch how the United States of America is leaving Afghanistan, leaving the people of Afghanistan to be slaughtered by the Taliban. It's very interesting. No political commentator. CNN is not talking. CNN is turned on some things. They want to know what is happening in Uganda. They want to give Uganda prominence. They want to do this. They want to that, to antagonize another African country. But they are not talking of their shortcomings. Why did they invade Afghanistan and leave it to the Taliban to occupy 95%, slaughtering the innocent Afghanistans who would have been left alone in the first place? That is what we want to find out as Africans. Do we need the European Union, the United States of America, NATO, to come to our continent, take it apart, then leave us in tears, and more tears? This is just a speech from me. I don't use notes. More and more tears in Tripoli. Look at Libya. Oh my God. Resolution 1970 of the United Nations Security Council mandated the French to drop bombs on Libya. Libya that was giving us tea, food, rice, sugar, money for education on the African continent. Muammar Gaddafi was giving us shelter. Is there any country in Africa that does not have Muammar Gaddafi's building? Show me one which does not have a building or which has never benefited from his generosity. Nations across Africa have benefited from the generosity of Muammar Gaddafi. He was brutally murdered. And then the same people now turn around and say Libya is in trouble. Libyans are beggars now, beggars. They beg. Yet we used to go to beg for education from Libya. Those are the type of things we want to look at. Ladies and gentlemen, those who have already come on the page of Pan-African Forum, I want to tell you, it is going to be an exciting day. Join in and listen. We are not going to keep quiet. We are going to say it as Africans. We are going to bring the curtain down. We are going to demand that enough is enough. I've given you a very good example of Somalia. They told Somalia that Somalia is too big to be governed. Siad Barre was told, immediately, please, can you try immediately, please, can you try and make Somalia, put Somalia under devolution? It was a strategy to dismember Somalia into several parts. It was devolution, one of the factors that brought Somalia to where we are. The same guys ran away very fast, left my Ugandan troops. And I want to take this opportunity to thank President Museveni and President Uhuru Kenyatta, and especially President Museveni for having been the first person to react on the situation of Somalia. We might have differences on a number of other things. Those are minor. But when it comes to Pan-Africanism, we are together. And that's where we have found a common bond. Mr. President, thank you very much. First, for sending the first group of Ugandans to enter Somalia, Mogadishu, to pacify Somalia, to create a better Somalia for tomorrow. We might not see it in coming, but we have stopped an Islamic State from operating near the borders of our countries. I want to thank the former President Kibaki and the current President of Kenya, President Uhuru Kenyatta, and the late President Nkurunziza for coming in. And my comrade, brother, friend, you have gone, you went too fast. My only comrade that I worked with in London, Zenawi, you decided to send troops into Somalia to pacify Somalia. Zenawi. Thank you very much, Zenawi. Brother, you remember in Islington, Hyber and Islington, wherever you were, my brother. You went fast. I will follow you, brother. But you made a contribution towards stabilization of Somalia. We were together, we worked together. We have another brother who has remained behind, and I will talk about him later. Isaias Efaki. We worked together in the same office. You were for Uganda, for Ethiopian Relief Association. I was for Uganda Community Relief Association, UKRA. Our time that we spend pacifying Africa. And I want to thank Dr. Tedros, my younger man. You know, when you talk about some younger people, people think I'm younger. I am older than Tedros, only that I don't have gray hair. Yes, 65 years. Yes, I've struggled for this continent. So when you look at this conflict across the world, look at the conflict of Boko Haram. Look at the conflict of Mali. Look at the conflict of Sahel region. Look at the conflict in Central African Republic. Look at the conflict in South Sudan. Look at the conflict in Mozambique. Look at the conflict in DRC Congo. Look at the conflict which is tearing everybody in Tripoli. The Turks have returned. Turkey has returned as a superpower under the auspices of NATO to occupy Africa through proxy war. Look at the conflict between Rwanda and Uganda, my own country. Do we deserve this as Africans? A Ugandan cannot travel to Rwanda. A Rwandese cannot travel to Uganda. Surely. And we call this African Union. Where is African Union? Who captured the African Union? Look at the emerging trend of the African bloc that is opposed. Over 34 countries are opposed to the inclusion of Israel as an observer state. Why were they not consulted? Why were they not consulted? Why? Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Mombasa is very hot. Therefore, you have to have a handkerchief on, and today it is going to be very hot because we are going to reveal very hot subjects. We are going to deliver subjects that will make people's hearts jump. Look at it. Is Turkey replacing? Wherever you see Turkey, wherever you see Total Oil, Shell, BP, what happens then? Proxy war. One comes with the drilling machine, then Qatar comes with money. Have you noticed that those two countries run together? Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Look at the uniforms that Al-Shabaab wear, and look at the uniforms in Saudi Arabia. Are you shocked as an African that the uniforms look alike? What happened to us? Where is African Union? Today, we are told that Mozambique needs help. We are told that Total Oil became a conduit. When you read this history, and my friends from Zimbabwe, Venus, Saxon, will bring you the real step inch by inch, how Cape Delgado, I'm not Portuguese, but I have a Portuguese granddaughter, Eradini, from my firstborn daughter, Miriam. She's watching because she said, Dad, I'll translate, Grandpa, I'll translate some words. Yes, yes, Africa. Many of you would like me to discuss internal dynamics of democracy. But perhaps I am the only person on planet Africa who thinks that Africa does not need elections. Yes. Do we need elections in Africa? For what? For killing each other? Do you need elections in Africa? Show me one country in Africa, apart from South Africa, which does not fight after elections. Show me. I'm standing here and I'm talking. Show me. Show me one country in Africa that does not contest the results of elections and go to court, waste money going to court. Show me. Show me ye. Today, I've come to tell you the truth, that Africa does not need elections. And if you want elections, go to the nearest transformer and put your head on the transformer of electricity. Burn yourself. Because you are going to kill your country. Is this not externally imposed system on Africa? Don't you think elections in Africa are a new concept? Isn't it time for Africa to find out why China gives us money when China 40 years ago, China 40 years ago, China was the poorest country with one rice scheme. In my country, Uganda, Kipimba. Believe President Museveni, you are watching this. You know very well, sir, that in our liberation struggle from 1978, 79, 80, 81, China was the poorest with one rice scheme where we are sharing rice with them and they were exporting the other half. That we are taking the other half as Ugandans. But because China went back and sat down, changed the modus operandi, Africa, China, today lends money to United States of America at night and says it doesn't like them during daytime. My fellow African, when Uhuru Kenyatta goes to borrow money from China, he's condemned. When President Museveni goes to borrow money from China during that time, he's condemned. But America borrows money from China at night, then they condemn each other during that time. Today we have the pandemic that is sweeping across the world. We have not had anywhere on planet Earth a contamination of the origin of this pandemic. We don't know. Today people are being told another variant is coming, another one is coming. Prepare for another one. Another one is coming. Another one is coming. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. How many of these variants are there? Africa. Is this our war? Are these conflicts ours? China today lends you money because they don't even have elections. Any of you participants and on the panel who are going to speak when you are called upon to speak, show me one MP of China you have seen in your town across Africa, and then I will give you another 10 shillings for your airtime. Oh, $10 for your time. $10. If you show me a member of parliament from China carrying a briefcase with 2 V8s running around the cities of Africa, I will give you $10. China has no MPs, but it's a functioning democracy, according to their democracy. That's why the people want to dismantle them. Doing very well. Yes, they are doing very well. They have a common bond, a social bond. Africa does not have a social bond. Africa has no social bond. Show me one African country that has a social bond, which gives its people a check every end of the month. The editor, the non-employed, where are they? Where is this country? Again, I'll give you $10. A check in Africa of the elderly retired takes 2 months to reach the elderly when he has died. This is the Africa where European Union comes with their packages. They package themselves, they say, we are going to solve a conflict in Mozambique. What the hell? This is African Union, where the European Union says we are going to support the people of Somalia. Then they end up themselves amongst the European Union countries. They say, how much gas and oil has Somalia got? They divide themselves. Another European Union country called Norway says we gave Somalis a lot of passports. When Siad Barre's government collapsed and Americans ran away in disarray. Now we need this gas and oil in the Indian Ocean. Now the boundary between Kenya and Somalia must be talked about in ICJ. Is this our position? Haven't we lived together with Somalis without the boundary? Can you tell me single-handedly, wherever you are in this Africa, whether you know which, can you tell which boundary in Indian Ocean when you are passing with a ship? Which boundary? Who made the boundary? Is it a self? Who imposed this conflict on us that we are today talking about imaginary oil, which is deep, deep down in the sea? Is this our war? Is this our war? If it is our war, tell me how Somalia and Kenya, if they went to war, tell me how it will benefit the two countries. The European Union will run in with aid. The same European Union is the one that allowed Norway to go across the Indian Ocean and find out the people that there is a boundary and there is oil under the Indian Ocean. We are watching a conflict coming very soon. The United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7 should sit down and look at stopping any international cases around the Indian Ocean regarding the oil blocks and the maritime borders between Kenya and Somalia. Ladies and gentlemen, those participants, those watching across Africa in the 54 nations, and those watching in the metros of Europe, is Africa a zone for conflict? If the answer to you is yes, who causes this conflict? And again, if you know the answer, who are they? Today, the conflict in the breakup of Nigeria, the sinking ship of Africa. We are seeing a ship sinking. A great country with a population of 200 million people has failed to resolve its conflicts through a political solution It has turned into judicial extraordinary measures to silence critics, to silence its people, to abduct, to rendette people across. Buhari has ever tried to kill Umar Diko until God took away Umar Diko. He wanted to steal Umar Diko in a coffin from a civilized democracy of United Kingdom. How will he be stopped from stealing anybody on planet Earth? There you are. There you are. I know there Mr. Simone Ekpa is here today from the people of Biafra. Simon Ekpa will tell us more about the sinking ship. Is this conflict in the north, in Maiduguri, in the north Maiduguri area? Boko Haram is cutting people's hands, ears, removing eyes, toes. And we in Africa are saying we're Africa, African Union. We are African Union. Heads of state wear suits with very good perfumes, bought from Paris. All of them, including Buhari, arriving in the African Union in a building built by Chinese. Why? And then they discuss nothing. Nigeria is sinking. Kidnap. As we talk today, we might not find women in the future in Nigeria. If you have not married in Nigeria, now you might not marry in the future because all the girls are being kidnapped, taken by Boko Haram, ISIS, and kidnappers. 3/4 of schooling children in Nigeria have been kidnapped. Younger people have been sexually defiled, killed, slaughtered. We might not find a generation of younger people in Nigeria anymore. Across in Cameroon, there started a leader called Paul Biya. In Amazonia, Paul Biya has killed for 4 years, actually for more than 4 years, since 1961. Nigeria, a neighbor of Cameroon, the governments have been conniving. Obasanjo connived and did not take this motion further from the General Assembly. Remember Resolution 1608 of the United Nations Security Council General Assembly that gave the people of Amazonia the right to self-determination. This resolution was never implemented by Nigeria, the fear of Biafra. Are we together today? Let Africa think. Where are we heading? In Amazonia, people are being slaughtered. Thousands have never seen school because of the French-English crisis. The French-English crisis. If you don't speak French in Cameroon, you are an enemy of Paul Biya. If you don't speak French in Cameroon, you are an enemy of Paul Biya. Is French an African country, language? Why should an African head of state force the people of Amazonia to speak French? Why doesn't he force them to speak their natural language? And you slaughter them, you ignore them, you sentence their leaders at 5 a.m. in the morning. I've never heard of a court that sits at 5 a.m. in the morning, and by the time you wake up, the guys had already been sentenced to life. In Cameroon. Is this the Africa we want? Across in Central African Republic. I'm giving you this so that it runs across, so that don't touch your country only. Talk about Africa. The conflict in Central African Republic is simply a conflict created by mercantile capitalism. Yes. Look at the mercantile capitalism that is taking shape in Central African Republic. Every 2 hours, each day, there is an Airbus leaving Charles de Gaulle Airport to go to Bangui. But it doesn't take passengers. It takes goods, equipment, mining equipment, maybe, and it carries back diamonds. A few months ago, United Nations French peacekeeping forces were found with diamonds and boxes of gold hidden in boxes, saying they were returning equipment to France. Does it worry you as an African? Is this the Africa we want? South Sudan. A few days ago, Dr. Riek Machar was purportedly ousted by his own generals. Who funds this conflict in South Sudan? Have you found out? Is it our conflict? The conflict across in Tigray that has sucked in people, many countries, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, Khartoum, and many other Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. All of you tell me you see you Africans, Ugandans, Kenyans are happy. I'm going to Dubai. I'm going to Dubai. You know what? I want to tell you one shocking revelation. I call Dubai River Road of Kenya. Why should I live in London and go to Dubai? Because it has become a river road of Kenya. Why? I hate their policies. Look at the way they fund wars. They fund wars across Africa. The conflict down or up in Tigray is a complex conflict. The European Union is saying, oh, we have to do something. America is saying, we have to do something. Why don't you do something to save the people? What are we waiting for? Who is benefiting from the conflict in Tigray? Who wants to divide Ethiopia into several parts? Who? At least it is not me. And at least it is not Professor PLO Lumumba would not like to see Ethiopia divided. At least it's not President Kisano who will speak later on this conference. At least it's not the participants that I see here who want a divided Ethiopia, a divided Africa. But the conflict, the question that remains on us is, as Miriam is going to come up to read the question to people, to the participants, I co-convener or co-host. I'm the main convener. She's the co-host. And in our organization, we give priority also to ladies to chair some sessions. Some of you who came in late, you found when we had already played a video that shows quite a lot. And I will ask the production team to bring the video as I make my remarks. Those were just remarks. I'm coming back with my paper later on. I want to tell you that each participant, if you are giving a paper, you have 10 minutes. Ekpa, the main speakers have 30 minutes. Those who are on the queue, you have 30 minutes. The keynote speaker, professor, has more time. When you finish and the words are finished, or you are exhausted, your Professor P.L. Lumumba, you can sit down. You have about 45 minutes to an hour, because you like speaking. Is here, we are here today, but because of the protocols of COVID-19, we could not be all of us. There were several people who wanted to come, but the regulations are very clear. Ekpa, you have 35 minutes. Kuwesa, you have 35 minutes. Section, you have 35 minutes. And others who want to make contribution quick, 2.5 or 3 minutes. If you are making a suggestion, 3 minutes. If you have a short discussion, please make it 2 minutes. Tell us your point, ask your question. We are here to answer you. And our role is to make sure that everybody is happy. We know the problems that are facing Nigeria. We know the problems that are facing the people of Cape Delgado. We know Rwanda and Burundi don't talk. We know Uganda and Rwanda don't talk. We know the conflict in the DRC Congo. Whose conflict is this? Whom does it benefit? Miriam will come up now. I will take this opportunity when the video is shown to take a briefer. I will introduce Professor P.L. Lumumba later on, after the video, to come and talk to us. As I told you, in the afternoon, more people are going to be online, including our guest of honor. The problems that kill Africa must be solved by Africans themselves. We must find a solution. And that solution is through talking, not through guns. I am a peacemaker, not a warmonger. I invite the video to play. Thank you. I want to call upon the people of Amazonia today, wherever you are in the diaspora, in Amazonia itself, that in a struggle you are bound to have divisions. But divisions should not divert you from the main focus, the main challenge. We have struggled to expose the happenings, the human rights abuses in Amazonia. The army has killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands,
burnt houses of people, internet was cut off, schools were closed, dispensaries, hospitals were burnt down. Amazonians should not be intimidated by Paul Robia. It is not upon the leaders of Amazonia, because I am not from Amazonia, but I've played a pivotal role in making sure that I loud out the voices, I put out the call, I call upon AU, EU, United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. Many of them have listened to some of the things that I say here, and they have come at last. America, United States of America, is slowly moving towards giving the Amazonian people the dignity they deserve. I therefore call upon the leaders and the leadership of the Amazonian people to unite for a purpose. The unity of purpose is paramount, as opposed to disunity, which has nothing but only produces ego that we have seen in South Sudan. What has killed South Sudan is not because they don't have the money, the minerals, the resources, is ego between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. We would not like to see that ego come to the people of Amazonia, the leadership of Amazonia. I call upon Samuel Sako, Akanga, Miran, and Ekpa to unite and talk with one voice on international scene that will bring about the peace, the tranquility that you yearn for since 1961, when Resolution 1608 was abandoned by the United Nations General Assembly and Amazonia was annexed by the Cameroon government by then. I call upon you, my brothers, to pick up the unity call and free your people without disintegration. Thank you. Viewers, those listening to this tape or this video, I want to bring to your attention that the politics of proxy wars in Africa is becoming real, and it has become a reality. I want to bring to this the attention of the African states that time and time again we have fallen victims of proxy wars. We fight wars that are not ours. We fall in conflicts that are not supposed to be, don't help Africa, and they don't help our countries at all. The proxy war that is in East and Central and the Horn of Africa has been ignited, supported, equipped by France. It has been very real that the French government, quietly through its company called Total Oil, has been searching for resources around the triangle of East and Central Africa and the Great Lakes region and the Horn of Africa. The LAPSET was one of them, which could have been a landmark project for the people of France. They withdrew from it. The Tanga to Mwanza, they made it, they withdrew from it. The search for oil and resources through Total Oil has brought us the dangers of a proxy war in the region. It is therefore very prudent for people of the region to understand the dynamics that we are going through. For example, in Rwanda and the Burundi conflict, there is a proxy war. We are fighting a proxy country. It has brought us to a war between the two countries, between Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi. There is a proxy war in Congo who is sponsoring a resurgence of of rebels that are fighting President Tshisekedi because he was not supported by countries that we know very well. This type of strategy has happened in North Africa, where Libya has been reduced to rebels, where each faction, even the government supported by United Nations, is being bombarded by a rebel called Khalifa Haftar, who is funded by countries that we know. The question of Somalia and the Kenyan maritime presents a challenge, a testy case for Africa and East Africa to stand firm and denounce the actions of countries that bring proxy wars and proxy politics in our region. It is therefore my humble submission that for this conflict, for this to end, we must do enough publicity, advocacy around the area to tell and explain to the international community why this problem is going to create an imbalance in the peace in the region, and the regional peace will be affected. It is therefore my humble submission that as a Ugandan whose troops, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers of other many millions Ugandans who are in Somalia, condemn any action by the Somali government to try to resolve issues that should have been resolved amicably as Africans within the African confines. I submit, therefore, that some of us will go a mile further to do now, from now onwards, to expose, to show the challenges of these countries that make us fight a proxy war in Africa. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, participants across the world, wherever you are, in Europe, we now officially start. We have already had remarks from myself, Dr. David Matsanga, the chairman of Pan-African Forum, the chairman of Punchline Africa TV, the Ion Africa Radio Punchline Africa, Africa World Media, and many organizations that come under my umbrella in the fight to make Africa better. I want to make it clear that this is a security-related meeting where we discuss the security of Africa, where Africa's security will come under scrutiny. It would be very prudent for security intelligence networks across Africa to listen, to take notes, to ask questions. Where have we gone wrong? Why is there no peace after every election? Why should countries in Africa preoccupy themselves with politics? Politics everywhere in Africa. If people are up in Tunisia, you have seen on the streets politics. During a pandemic, people are still talking of elections across Africa, not only Kenya, not only Uganda, not only Tunisia. You see in South Sudan, you see in Ethiopia, you have seen in Somalia, an election that is a mirage. This morning, the keynote speakers for the morning session will be Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, a constitutional lawyer, a speaker, a motivational speaker, a man who has been with me in and out in difficulties. We have been together struggling to put a word for Africa. There are challenges when people say, why don't you put your house in order before you come to tell us? But for us, our houses are not in Kenya or in Uganda. Our houses are in Africa. We cherish the dream. We love the dream of Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Gabriel Nasser, Haile Selassie, Milton Obote, Julius Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, Benabera. Look at those guys who stood up. Baba Tafawa Balewa, I think so. I cannot forget that guy, that gentleman from Hamid, Sekou Touré. Look, these gallant sons of Africa who stood up and said, hey, 50 years to come, you remember us. 60 years to come, remember our words. Nkrumah told you, whatever Nkrumah is today, must be saying, I told you. And the time is going to come when you also will say, we told you. Those who will come on the generation when I and the professor, because we don't know when we are going. None of us knows the date. And there are some prophets here who know the dates. Me, I don't know. I'm guided by God's will. Professor Pierre Lumumba has been at the forefront of talking about Africa. Most of you know his speeches. Some have taken his speeches, utilized them. Some have taken them and turned them into lethal weapons against their own states. Honestly, that's the Africa we have. I don't know how many Africans know that the United States borrows money at night from China, then tells us during that time, if we find you going to China, we shall stamp your passport, no entry. Hey. So Pierre Lumumba is a man who did not grow where jiggers come from. But for me, my country has had several jiggers, but not in my tribe. It is only one tribe in Uganda which has jiggers commonly, that is Busoga. I am from a mountainous place in Mount Elgon, where Chemtai, who got the golden medal, comes from. Hallelujah, Chemtai, hallelujah. Today, we've taken a gold medal. The lady can run. She's from the place where I come from. Tall. We are all tall. 6 feet. They are going to grow. If she's not growing, she's growing higher. So thank you. I come from that country called the Pearl of Africa. Today we are not here to discuss our countries. We are here to discuss Africa. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce Professor Pierre Lumumba and to allow Miriam just to call him, because as Miriam comes in, let him not come now. Miriam will call him, because Miriam is also a descendant of Professor Pierre Lumumba. Another speaker will be Simone Ekpa. Simon Ekpa is from Biafra. He's in amalgamated Nigeria, a forced Nigeria. They call it a zoo. Some people say it is a zoo, but as a state from AU records and the UN records, Simon Ekpa will speak as a Biafran. We'll speak this morning and I will speak again in the afternoon. Discuss several other aspects. It will make light known to the people of what is going on in his country. Another speaker will be Dr. Nyachama. Dr. Nyachama is a man who understands human beings. He will speak from that point of humanity. What can we do for Africa? Another speaker will be Juliet Mahapira from London. Juliet will speak from the women point of view in the diaspora. She's a senior member of the Liberal Democratic Party. She's a Kenyan from Kitale, but she has become very powerful in London to the extent of reaching the House of Commons, trying to run for parliamentary seats on the ticket of Liberal Democrats. And I told her to run on Labour Party like me, because I'm a member of the Labour Party. In fact, if it had not been Zimbabwe, Professor, I had not told you this, I would have been the first direct African to enter House of Commons. Tony Blair and Robin Cook had given me a constituency where Labour was the majority. To run, that is Croydon Central. I was going to be one powerful figure in the House of Commons from direct the mountains of Uganda. But because of standing for Africa and speaking for Mugabe, I turned on the Labour Party and denounced it for putting sanctions on Zimbabwe. We fell out with Tony Blair and with Claire Short and Peter Haynes. I lost. But up to now, I am a member of the constituency, a delegate of the constituency to the General Assembly, to the Delegates Conference of the Labour Party. And I've told this lady, Juliet Mahapira from Kenya, that the only party that you can sell through to House of Commons is either Conservative or Labour. As you see, the Home Secretary for Britain is Ugandan. Yes, the lady is from Uganda. You see, things work very well. I would have been maybe in that first Labour minister, I would have been a minister for Africa to whip PLO. I don't know. So, thank you very much. Mahapira will come from London. And the other speakers, those who want to speak, there is a lady from there is a lady from Khartoum who will speak. I'm going to give you the names. Then there is a good lady from Lusaka, Madame Masowe, what? Madame Masowe from Zambia. She will speak this morning. And then there are other speakers whom you see on the rest of you. Miriam will be calling your names or will update the register as it is. Now I call upon Miriam to take over the hosting, and I invite Professor PLO Lumumba to the podium. Thank you.
All right, Doctor, thank you so much. You're coming to us from the White Sands there in Mombasa. My name is Miriam Ogut, for those who are watching, and I'm at the general headquarters here in Nairobi, Kenya. Indeed, a very warm welcome to you. And as you already know from the title that you have on your screen, this morning, our topic of discussion on the Pan-African Conference is EU deployment in Africa, conflict zones for political stability or their own economic stability. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Professor PLO Lumumba. Professor, a warm welcome to you.
First, let me start by thanking the Pan-African Forum Limited and its founder, Dr. David Matsanga, for putting together this conversation. This is a very important conversation, particularly at this time in the life of the continent of Africa. We are having this conversation at a time when there are many conflicts in the continent of Africa in the manner in which Dr. Matsanga has outlined. And these conflicts have different DNAs, if you may. One of the most important, and I use the word important very deliberately, conflicts currently going on is in Ethiopia, and is a conflict that threatens to break up the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, which is the headquarters of the Organization of African Unity, now turned into the African Union. Only yesterday, reports tell us that the Tigray army has occupied the important town of Lalibela. And what is worrying is that we have not heard the voice of the chair of the African Union, nor have we heard the voice of the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Felix Tshisekedi, who is the current chair. We have not heard the leaders of IGAD speak. We have not heard the leaders of the East African community speak. We have not heard the leaders of ECOWAS speak. We have not heard the leaders of SADC speak. We have not heard the leaders of the Central African countries speak. We have not heard the leaders of Maghreb speak. We have heard muted and apologetic voices from the United Nations. And yet we know that men, women, and children are suffering with bodies floating in various water bodies. And that is just one conflict. We know that there is instability in Somalia, and that Somalia has gone through a very long period of instability, which has created an environment that is hostile to the realization of sustainable peace. We know that in the recent past, there has and continues to be insurgency in Mozambique. Commentators suggest that it is a religious war, but the anatomy of that war has not been understood properly. But whatever it is, it cannot be denied that it threatens the peace, not only of Mozambique, but of southern Tanzania. We have seen the continued instability on the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which country has never known peace and quiet since the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba in 1961. We know that Central African Republic has also had problems, and that there is no peace and quiet there. We also know that South Sudan is struggling to get out of conflict. And as had been stated this morning and yesterday in the media, no sooner had we imagined that with the swearing in of 588 members of parliament in Juba would herald a new peaceful dispensation, then we are told that another faction of Riek Machar's political party have disowned him, and almost immediately his own faction have disowned the other faction, which means that there is a breeding ground for conflict. In Sudan, we know of the conflict in the Nuba Mountain, in the Blue Nile, and in Darfur. We also know that Libya continues to be in difficulties, and we cannot forget the recent assassination of President Abi Itno and the continued instability in Chad. In Burkina Faso, we know that there is conflict as we speak, and the same may be said of Mali, of Mauritania, and of course, the Amazonian problem, which continues to fester. And we cannot forget that even in Senegal, which we may think is peaceful, the people in the Casamance region have their own problems with the Dhaka administration. Those are conflicts which are of high tension nature. But we also know that in the countries which appear to have peace, every election cycle threatens those very nations. In Kenya, we know that in the year 2007, the country nearly degenerated into civil war when the political class mobilized the population and weaponized their constituencies until through international intervention, the country was saved from falling into the abyss of civil war. The same was repeated in Kenya in the year 2017, and as the country approaches the elections in 2022, the drums of war are already beating. In Zambia, we are already aware that the president has asked the armed forces to be deployed into the streets as they prepare for their elections on the 12th day of August. And we know that every election cycle in different countries, only yesterday, the 5th day of August 2021, we saw young men and women in a most disciplined way demonstrating in the streets of Accra, Ghana, and demanding that they must have jobs. Africa is in a crisis. And that crisis is the one that begs the question which is on the table, and which I beg to rephrase. Are the conflicts in Africa internally generated or externally manufactured and fueled internally? Is it the case that the erstwhile colonial powers now operating under the aegis of the European Union, the manufacturers of those conflicts? Is it possible that even those that have left the European Union, such as the United Kingdom, are part of that conflict? In a nutshell, the question that is on the table is, why is it that so many years after the bulk of African countries regained their independence, the fragility of the African nation threatens the post-colonial state? In order to understand that question, I think it is important that we address ourselves, albeit briefly, to the historical origin of the modern African state. It is something that has been stated times without number, but in order to contextualize our conversation, it's important to repeat it again. The modern African state, and I'm using the word modern very guardedly, is a product of the Berlin Conference, which was held in Berlin, Germany, between the months of November 1884 and the month of February 1885. The very reason why that meeting was held is because the European powers divided the African continent into their spheres of influence for purposes of exploitation. The product of that particular engagement is that each of the European powers had their own spheres of influence, with France taking their own share, the Germans their own share, the Italians their own share, the British their own share, the Portuguese their own share, the Belgians their own share, and of course, we know that in certain parts of the continent, even the Arabs were present in countries such as Zanzibar. And the net effect of all these was that Africa was fragmented and African territories were then arbitrarily parceled out into what we now call the African countries. Chinua Achebe captures the end product of the Berlin Conference in his book, The Trouble with Nigeria, written in 1983, when he says that most African countries are mere geographical expressions and that they are created deliberately and designed to collapse. It is in this regard that you can understand that in a country such as Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, you find different African nations distributed amongst these countries, as is the case in Nigeria, as is the case in most African countries, and that therefore, when the colonial enterprise was brought to an end, the post-colonial state was not meant to succeed, they were designed to fail. And indeed, in the cases of countries such as France, they were not even pretentious about it, so that they entered into a pact for the continuation of colonization, which saw former French colonies to continue to be treated as being under the tutelage of France and being directed from Paris. Indeed, that meant, among other things, that their economies were controlled from the French government, complete with a currency, the CFA franc, which is printed, distributed, and whose value is determined by the Paris government. That also remains true of the former Portuguese colonies, which were wrestled out of the combined Marcelo Caetano and Antonio de Spinola regimes in the 1970s and 1980s, when through sustained struggle, independence was captured from them by the Mozambicans, the Angolans, the Cabo Verdeans, and the Guinea-Bissauans. And of course, we know that the same was true of the former British colonies, and ultimately in Southern Africa, if they were arrested from the apartheid regime, which was a product of the apartheid philosophy articulated in 1948 by the Nationalist Party of Hendrik Verwoerd. Africa, therefore, is a continent that must be understood as the home of diversity. Somebody described that form of diversity, I think it is Simone from Nigeria, specifically in the Biafra region, who says that in Africa there is a dangerous form of diversity which militates against our unity unless it is understood and used to mediate African conflicts. That is the continent in which we find ourselves. And Africa has always been a victim, as all of us know, of diabolical conspiracies and diabolical machinations of the former colonial powers. Indeed, one can say that no sooner had African countries started regaining their independence than the former colonial powers started plotting the destruction and or destabilization of African countries. It is instructive that as early as 1961 in countries such as what we now describe as the Democratic Republic of Congo, individuals who were seen to be progressive, such as Patrice Emery Lumumba, were assassinated. The same fate was to meet Sylvanus Olympio in Togo. And no sooner had that happened, you will remember that other great African leaders were also assassinated. But let us retrace a little to understand how the diabolical machination started very early on in the history of Africa. Prior or immediately after the independence of Ghana, which was the leading country in that regard, and I'm excluding Liberia, which was created in a unique manner in 1847, and excluding Ethiopia and excluding Egypt to a certain extent, and Sudan. When Kwame Nkrumah led the Ghanaians to regain their political independence, one could see the hidden hands of foreign powers at that time. I remember, courtesy of history, that after Ghana regained our independence, in a speech that was delivered on the day of independence, the Osage for Kwame Nkrumah was as eloquent as he was passionate in reminding Ghanaians that the independence of Ghana meant nothing unless all other African countries regained their independence. And it is on that basis that he told them that the imperialists will always have different ways of ensuring that they stay in the continent of Africa. He said that imperialists do not change their character. They may wear different masks. They may come as investors. They may come as donors, but their agenda and their scheme remains one and the same: to subjugate and to manipulate the African continent. It is on that basis and guided by that principle that in 1958, Kwame Nkrumah convened a meeting of African leaders, urging them that there was a need to create a front that was going to ensure that post-colonization, the neo-colonial project, was not allowed to take root in Africa. As 2 years later, Kwame Nkrumah with King Hassan of Morocco convened yet another meeting in Casablanca in Morocco, and that group of individuals who believed in the total and genuine independence of the continent of Africa, not flag independence, were christened the Casablanca group. At the same time, the erstwhile colonizer led by the French under the leadership of their retired Army General Charles de Gaulle had recruited Cote d'Ivoire's Felix Houphouët-Boigny and Tubman of Liberia, and indeed they had a meeting initially in Monrovia in Liberia and subsequently in Antananarivo in what is now known as Madagascar, then known as Malagasy, and that created what was then described as the Monrovia Group. So that when Haile Selassie convened a meeting in the month of May between the 23rd and 25th days of May in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, there were two factions which were on the table at that time. One can say that there was the Casablanca group, which was clear in its mind that Africa needed to enjoy total liberation and to ensure that the neo-colonial project was not allowed to thrive, and the Monrovia group, which was led and whose agenda was articulated by Felix Houphouët-Boigny, who took the view that Africa needed to grow away, and I'm using the word grow very deliberately, from colonialism in a gradualist way. It can be said that despite the urging, despite the spirited cajolement of Kwame Nkrumah, it is the Monrovia group that won the day in Addis Ababa in 1963. And instead of a United States of Africa, we ended up with the Organization of African Unity, which was a watered down version of the United States of Africa that Kwame Nkrumah had demanded as a way of immunizing the continent against the vagaries of the neo-colonial project. And I dare say that today we are paying for the choice of those lukewarm leaders not to listen to Kwame Nkrumah. Because when they did so, in a very surreptitious and in a very diabolical way, the erstwhile colonizers continued to be the puppeteers, and the newly colonized countries became puppets and marionettes, which were controlled. If they were not controlled from Brussels, as in the case of Congo, they were controlled from Paris, or they were controlled from London, or they were controlled from Madrid, and of course, subsequently, some of them were to be controlled from Moscow and from Washington during the Cold War. The net effect, therefore, is that Africa has always been a continent that is under the attack and assault of foreign powers. Even as Africa was continuing to labor under the choreographed machinations of the Western powers, which were designed to ensure that African resources were being taken away, other powers were also coming into the continent of Africa. It is in this context that we must understand the coming into force of the Soviet Union after the World War II and the emergence of the Soviet Union as one of the world powers, and the emergence of the United States of America as the other world hegemon. There was now a contestation of an ideological nature, and Africa became a theater of this conflict. Leaders either affiliated themselves to the Moscow spirit of communism or affiliated themselves to the Washington philosophy of capitalism. Even if those leaders had been, or those countries had been colonized by France or the United Kingdom, the greater Q now came from Washington, which was leader of the conceptual West, in the same way that Moscow was leader of the conceptual East. What we then saw were conflicts and the propping up of dictators. How many of you listening to me and present in this forum will not remember that leaders such as Joseph Desire Mobutu, later to rename himself Mobutu Sese Seko, remained in power because he was a puppet of the Washington regime? How many of you will forget that leaders such as Jean Bedel Bokassa in Central African Republic remained in power because they were puppets? How many of you will remember that leaders such as Marcius Nguema Biyogo remained in power because they were puppets? And how many of you will forget that even leaders such as Dauda Kairaba Jawara in Gambia remained because they were puppets of the West, including with titles of adulation such as Sir Dauda Kairaba Jawara? And how many of you will forget that leaders such as Siad Barre and Mengistu Haile Mariam remained in power because they were being supported by the Moscow government? And we know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, then the world changed in what was described by political commentators and political scientists as a unipolar world. And the systems that were under the tutelage of the communist powers now came under the sphere or the domination of the United States of America and resurgent European Union powers, who are now telling African countries that the only way in which we could lend you money, because at that time economies had also been destroyed and the only available sources of lending were Western institutions, the Bretton Woods institution to be exact, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. What we were then told, and African countries and African politicians were told, in order to be accepted into the fold of the politically civilized, you had to embrace something that was described as democracy. And this democracy had to be defined by the conceptual West. And it meant, among other things, that you had to embrace multi-party politics. It meant that you had to hold frequent elections periodic. It meant that you had to have heads of state, presidents, or prime ministers whose terms were limited. It meant that you had to have non-governmental organizations, most of which were funded from European powers and whose agenda was to articulate Western ideas of human rights and Western agendas in other spheres. Many African countries found themselves coming into that fold, so that many of the intellectuals in Africa, whether they like it or not, became proposal writing machines, writing proposals to NGOs in Germany, NGOs in the United States of America, NGOs in Sweden, NGOs in different parts of the world. And despite their protestation to the contrary, they merely were puppets. They merely were recipients of little pittances being paid to them. And he who pays the piper, the old saying goes, calls the tune. So you had an African intelligentsia who, to use that neo-Marxist term, and I'm saying this is neo-Marxist, I'm not myself a Marxist, but they were and could be described as the comprador bourgeois. And these comprador bourgeois continue to operate in Africa under different guises. You find them in NGOs, you find them in governments, and I dare say that they are the fifth columnists via which these Western organizations and Western powers continue to operate in the continent of Africa. And of course, as Marx once said, the safety of this comprador bourgeois demands that the masses of the people be kept in the most profound ignorance. And what do, these individuals? In order to sustain their agenda, they have now perfected the art of mobilizing their citizens who are ordinarily people from their ethnic groups. The mobilization of ethnic groups and the creation of political parties which do not have the character of political parties, they have no ideological anchors, is what now creates problems in Africa, amongst many other things. And I dare say in many African countries, there are no political parties as understood in different parts of the world. The political parties we have are actually ethnic enclaves led by, depending on which country one is talking about, low voltage ethnic warlords whose only desire is to seek political office for nothing else other than material aggrandizement. In the minds of these men and women, in certain cases, the only agenda that they have is that they must seek and seize the instruments of the state and use them for personal benefit. And that is why we talk about the concept of the prebendal state, where the agenda of those who get into political power is to share state revenue and is only the crumbs that are available for the general population. When you are operating in an environment such as that, then you must know that conflict is always knocking at your door if it is not in fact sitting in your very sitting room. And I dare say that that is where Africa now finds herself. In the recent past, of course, we have seen the emergence of China. China has come into the African scene like a juggernaut. It has come in the nature of a Trojan horse. It comes with goodies in the forms of railways, in the forms of stadia, in the form of roads, in the form of development of ports and other things which are visible and which can then be waved to the gullible electorate as constituting development. And in that way, China has entered the hearts and minds of very many African leaders. And today, there are very few African countries which are not under the beck and call of China. Has it ever been lost on you? Have you ever not wondered why it is that Africa, with our 54, 55 countries, depending on whether Morocco agrees that Sahrawi is a country or not, why it is that it's only African countries that periodically once a year are summoned to Beijing, and all of them run to Beijing to be addressed by one leader of China? Have you ever wondered why it is only Africa whose leaders are summoned to Tokyo to be addressed by the Prime Minister of Japan? Have you ever wondered why African leaders are the only ones who are summoned to Washington to be addressed by the leader of the United States? Have you ever wondered why African leaders are the only ones that are summoned to Moscow to be addressed by the president of Russia? Have you ever wondered why Africans are the only leaders who are summoned to Germany to be addressed by the Chancellor of Germany? Have you ever wondered why African leaders are the only ones who are summoned to New Delhi to be addressed by the Prime Minister of India? Have you ever wondered why Africans are the only ones who are summoned to the Arab world to be addressed by the King of Qatar? It is because Africa is the theater. Africa is the home of resources, and African leaders are mere marionettes and puppets who are manipulated to the detriment of the people. That is not to say that there are no exceptions in Africa. There are few African leaders who have tried to speak out. And in this regard, I never forget the late John Joseph Pombe Magufuli. I never forget Paul Kagame. I never forget occasionally Hage Geingob. And occasionally in his younger days, of course, I never forget Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. And in his younger and better days, Robert Mugabe. And of course, there were others in the period before this period, which I'm talking about now. But the truth is that the Africa that I'm talking about is an Africa that is in a crisis of monumental proportions, which then legitimizes for me to ask the question again: what is the source of African conflict? Let us remember that conflict is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If you look at the economies of countries that look innocent, such as Sweden, and look at what brings money to their economies is weapons. If you look at the economies of most countries in Europe and America, and what injects money to the economy is weaponry, small arms, and other things. And in order for these industries to remain alive, conflicts must be manufactured. Africans must be made to fight, to engage in fratricidal wars. And we can see these fratricidal wars in Ethiopia now. We see fratricidal wars in Sudan. We see fratricidal wars in Southern Sudan. We see fratricidal wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo, fratricidal wars in Mozambique, fratricidal wars in Cameroon and in Amazonia, fratricidal wars in Mali, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Mauritania, in Libya, and in many parts of Africa. And when these wars are being prosecuted, money is being made in the billions. And you must also know that poverty is also a multi-billion-dollar industry. And as long as you ensure that Africans are wallowing in the muck and mire of poverty, you can engage in humanitarian action, and in that way you continue to sustain Western organizations. War and poverty are multi-million-dollar industries. But does it mean that we ourselves are free of guilt? No, we are co-authors of our own misfortune. The misfortune of Africa is that her men and women who have had the honor and privilege of presiding over our affairs post-independence, except for a very few of them, have been men and women who have no agenda for the continent. There are men and women who want to occupy political office for personal aggrandizement, as I said. There are men and women whose only desire is to lord it over their people. There are men and women who are possessed by the spirit of egotism and megalomania. There are men and women who have no vision for their country. There are men and women who are myopic. There are men and women who do not want to address the critical problems of food, the critical problems of health. There are men and women who, as we have seen during this pandemic, cannot lead their countries to embrace science. There are men and women who, instead of embracing technology, are engaging in embracing theology, not knowing that the problems of technology cannot be solved by theology. We cannot pray into action that which we can acquire through science. So Africa can only liberate herself when she realizes genuinely that her future not only demands but requires that she must stop and pause and ask herself, what is our trajectory? Africa must get into a clear understanding that her present structures are not going to solve our problems. You cannot pour new wine in old wineskins. Organizations which are in a suspended state of animation, such as the African Union, must be revamped and reorganized if Africa is to know and to realize our potential. I know that in the recent past, we have come up with projections and schemes such as Africa Agenda 2063, and there is nothing wrong with the promises of Africa Agenda 2063. I know that we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and there is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with the Maputo Protocol. There is nothing wrong with the Malabo Protocol. There is nothing wrong with the Kigali Protocol. There is nothing wrong with all those initiatives. But what I know is that mere pronouncements in and of themselves without accompanying and deliberate action, which is informed by the desire to change the continent in a dramatic way, is not going to help us solve our problems. So we can blame European Union all we want. We can blame China all we want. We can blame the United Kingdom all we want. We can blame the United States all we want. But we must also remember that we have contributed to our own misfortune. Is it not the case that when we were fighting for independence through our fathers, we gave ourselves a promise that we needed independence in order to demonstrate to the world that we had the intellectual wherewithal to run our affairs? Did we not tell ourselves that our independence was more than our national anthems, more than our flags, more than our mottos, and that we would not allow our imposed boundaries to stand in the way of our creative unity? Did we not tell ourselves that? Did we not tell ourselves that we were going to ensure that our people would have good health facilities? Did not tell ourselves that we were going to fight ignorance through education, through science and innovation? Did we not tell ourselves that we were going to feed ourselves by having agriculture that is sound and is not rain dependent? Did we not tell ourselves that we were going to use our resources? Did we not tell ourselves that Africa was going to be liberated? We told ourselves those things, but because, as Chinua Achebe rightly said in 1983, the problem of Africa is simply and squarely a problem of leadership, and I dare say even that of followership, because we who are the voters, we who are in the majority, we have allowed ourselves to create monsters unto ourselves. We have allowed those who stand in positions of leadership to think that they are demigods. And when you have treated people as demigods for too long, they now suffer from the martyr complex. They now suffer from the Messiah complex. And they think that we are mere marionettes and puppets to be manipulated. And they consume all the things that we ought to consume. Africa will only liberate herself from the day that we realize that the problems of Africa can only be solved by ourselves. But we must wake up and be prepared to roll our sleeves. And when we do that, and do that in a sustainable and undisciplined manner, Africa will stop blaming others and begin to use our monumental resources for the benefit of the continent. It can be done, it must be done, and it is only you who can do it. As Julius Kambarage Nyerere famously said, it can be done, play your part. And as the Osagie Kwame Nkrumah famously said, we cannot solve these problems by looking east or west, we must look forward. Thank you very much.
Professor PLO Lumumba. I think one of the key messages that I've gotten from that speech is that as much as we want to blame the East or the West, but Africans, we've become the co-authors of our own misfortunes. So I think even some of the solutions must start with us. Thank you so much, Professor PLO Lumumba, for that, and posing very important questions that we need to, interrogate as Africans, if at all we need to move forward as a continent. All right. So before I bring in Simon Ekpa, I'd like to bring in Saxon from Zimbabwe. Saxon, it's your time now.
Good morning. Good morning, panelists. Good morning, viewers. I'm gonna mostly focus on why European nations intervene militarily in Africa. One of the main reasons that nations in Europe intervene in African conflicts is for their economic benefit. When a conflict occurs in Africa, the response of European actors is generally inaction. This can be explained in several ways. Number one, the absence of strategic and economic interest to them. If there are no interest to them, they don't have an appetite to intervene because that doesn't benefit them. Number two, the unwillingness of European leaders to become involved in conflicts in former colonies. Number three, and sometimes the Eurocentric assumption that conflict in Africa is a normal event which does not require intervention. By not intervening in conflicts in Africa, they assume that it's our normal way of fighting. So to them, they say there's no need for intervention. When European actors do decide to intervene, it is primarily for motives of security, prestige, economic interest, rather than for humanitarian reasons. The weight of the past relations with Africa can also be a driver for European military interventions, but the impact of that past is changing. France's enduring ability to project military power on the African continent and influence political events there yet has been central to its self-perception as a major power. However, since the end of the Cold War, France's paternalistic interference has been increasingly questioned, not at least by Africans, but by other nations as well. This has produced a gradual and somewhat reluctant turn to multilateralism on the part of the French leaders. Drawing on in-depth case studies of recent French intervention policy, France's efforts to reassure critics is by securing multilateral endorsements, shared burdens and liabilities through collective implementation, and reaffirm its status as a major power by spreading complex missions through its intelligence system, which we must is humanitarian help and not direct foreign French help. The threat of terrorism is been prioritized over issues of material wealth, outright, and the environment, which are equally potent threats to human society in the context of France. Such a threat is intersubjective and can be used to justify not only military action, but also determines development strategies, climate change action, democratic change, and even territory of the African states, so long the actors external to Africa continue to draw the narrative. First, neoliberal economic policies that impose the austerity on African governments increased the likelihood of armed conflict, which in turn led to selective intervention by foreign regimes. You understand, during the early 1990s, IMF, the Bretton Woods Institute, they sold the economic social adjustment programs to many nations. And these social adjustment programs led to destruction of social safety nets, which had been put in place by newly independent states, and thereby this led to a lot of riots, demonstration. For instance, I can give an example in Zimbabwe in 1999, when the West riots, which were caused by a rise in staple food or maize meal, because the IMF had said we should remove subsidies. But we were a young economy which was donor dependent. So you see how these neoliberal economic policies impacted on African governments, thereby creating conflict which warranted them to intervene. Like in 1991 with the 1991 Somali War, where Muhammad said Bara did to wage a protracted war with the US Marines, which this war later became the burden for Africa after the Americans fled the butchering by the Somali terror army. Secondly, the US military presence expanded after the 9/11 terror attacks, and this impacted African setup. I think we've started noticing the terror groups, the Al Qaeda and Mahreb, now with ISIS. This is as a result of a foreign creation where these guys were fighting their own wars. Like the issue of terror started in 1979 when the United States funded the Mujahideen for when they were fighting the Soviet Union. And later they broke ranks with the Al Qaeda, Bin Laden, who later started setting bases in Africa. And Africans paid dearly for this. Americans started bombing the terror targets. And in turn, these terrorists started killing African people. And the Americans later set up bases here. And these bases were not only for humanitarian purpose, but were meant to protect their own interests. The same applies to nations like United Kingdom. They also came in under the guise of fighting terror. And if you've noticed, the problem of terrorism is increased in Africa because of their presence. They've got the issue of Arab-Israeli conflict, which the Americans and the Europeans are supporting the Israelis. And these terrorists only follow them to destabilize them and to fight back, like targeting their interests. In the same vein, the Africans are caught in the web. The decline of humanitarian justification for military intervention might signal broader trend in which the protection of human rights, the right to protect, which was used in the attack of Libya in 2011, also in Mali in 2013. Libyan intervention under the pretext of the right to protect was a cover-up, as the real reason was to start with the vision of the United States of Africa, which was championed by the late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The vision of late Colonel Gaddafi was going to affect the economic interests of the Europeans. So the only way they had to do was to remove him. And they'd used some of African nations, like South Africa, who voted for the resolution which authorized military attack on Libya. And at the end of the day, you've seen these military conflicts, they don't benefit Africa at all. Intervention by the Europeans. Right now, if you look at Libya, life is worse off. The Europeans have looted oil. If you were to check the deposits of oil reserves, so whenever the Europeans intervene, they intervene for their own economic interests or prestige. I cite a few examples of conflicts where the Europeans have paid a death because their interests were not affected, or even they participated to support those conflicts. The conflict resolution community seems to pursue conflict resolution efforts in Africa from a variety of purposes and interests, and with policies that are often replete with ambiguities and contradictions. This situation may be the reason why many African conflicts may be silenced but remain largely unresolved, because the underlying factors of those conflicts do not have been addressed. It will be more cosmetic solutions that would have been suggested. The situation may be, okay, because African conflict involves the activities of seasoned peacemakers using the best of personal skills and recently developed knowledge about ways of managing and resolving conflict. International efforts at conflict management has not been particularly effective or efficient in overcoming disasters that have brought them into the continent. The critical question then is how we understand the problem of conflict resolution in Africa. When the actors, mainly external to Africa, propagate the ideas of peace and conflict resolution, corresponding mainly to their own interests and views of African world. The examples of military and economic pacts concluded by French-speaking leaders with France's independence are a case in point. In many cases, these facts have not been rescinded half a century after independence. And that is why former French colonies either still have the French military stationed in their countries or continue to call for France for military interventions, as in the case of the Central African Republic and Mali. In Africa, the concept of state or nation is based on Africa's colonial past. Article 4 of the Constitutive Act of the African Union places emphasis on the respect for state boundaries inherited at independence. African states have also remained spheres of influence of former colonial powers, and no power in the world has been interested in changing that situation. The European concept of state has had a strong influence on African countries, and it was this concept of state that led to drawing up of arbitrary borders throughout Africa. Such Eurocentric thinking, reinforced by technological and scientific achievements, is still very present in Africa. Colonial rule was the antithesis of democracy because it was premised on the usurpation of a fundamental right to self-determination and of the fundamental human rights of citizens and people. Okoyo in 1997 work underscored that the fact that whatever legitimate colonialism possessed was derived not from any set of agreed rules or consensus, but from the monopoly of the means of coercion and violence, and by its divide and rule strategies aimed at intensifying the cleavages, which were the cleavages on class, tribal, and religious, which were inherent in the social structure and at prolonging its rule. Colonial rule never raised the issue of good governance. A review of intervention efforts in African conflict in the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century brings out 2 main trends in regard to the main actors or agencies and the intervention approaches involved. The first trend shows that the main actors intervening in African conflict were almost entirely from outside of Africa. These were individuals, countries or group of countries, institutions or organizations. Until 1993, Africa was almost totally dependent on outside entities for conflict management. Some of these outside entities or actors included former colonial masters, international organizations, and foreign powers like United Nations, European Community, and the United States of America, as well as regional efforts like Economic Community for West African States, ECOWAS, in West Africa, and Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Desertification, IGAD, in East Africa, and a number of non-governmental actors such as former President Jimmy Carter and Julius Nyerere. The second strong idea that emerges from intervention literature is the increasing emphasis on conflict management rather than resolution as the intervention approach in Africa. China seems to be also expanding its influence in Africa because of its policy. China has the advantage of never having enslaved or colonized the continent. China has also not made the false promises quoted with the neoliberalism, whilst the West and the IMF and the World Bank put conditions that only aid in the uplifting of Africa. China has so far been willing to provide unconditional aid and invest in infrastructure. At the same time, however, it freely takes full advantage of the opening up of markets and that neoliberal economic policy over the last 25 years have offered and incumbent. So far, unlike the United States, China has not sought to establish military bases in Africa to protect its economic interests, which the US has sought to establish through the setting up of the AFRICOM. International humanitarian and peacekeeping efforts have often been marred by conflicting interests that have sometimes hurt the people they intend to assist. The war on terror, like it's called war pre-anti-dissent, has increased American and European military presence on the continent, generated a new external support for repressive governments, and contributed to an escalation of violence in many regions. Rather than promoting security, outside intervention has often intensified strife and undermined prospects of peace and demonstrating once again how failure to learn from the past is obscured the pitfalls of the future. European military interventions are either meant to destabilize African nations or meant to protect their economic interests. When Mozambique waged a brutal civil war, which ended with the signing of the Roma Accord in 1992, and the African initiated peace deal around 2013, we didn't see any European nations intervening in the crisis, which killed many millions, because this crisis was their own creation. For your own information, the Renamo outfit was the creation of the Rhodesian Central Intelligence Organization. It was led by Ken Flower. And when Zimbabwe got its independence, the Central Intelligence structure changed, and the Renamo was now funded by the apartheid in South Africa. The Europeans and the Americans didn't even intervene in save the lives of Mozambicans in 1976 and around 2013 when they were sporadic disturbance after the 1992 Roma Code, because their interests were not served. When Mozambique discovered oil in 2011 and the Europeans invested, and the terror group started their marauding wars in around 2017, the Europeans became interested because their interests were affected, meaning they don't value us, they value their prestige and their economic interests. Europeans and Americans don't value Africans and so on by their inept protect Africans from civil wars, which they've been funding since the 1970s. The Mozambican Renamo has been funded by their kids and kin, and these European nations never made an effort to resolve the conflict. But now they are raising, they are even deploying troops in Cabo Delgado because Shell, Total, and other European countries' business interests are now affected. Right now in Mozambique, they are disturbing in central Mozambique from the breakaway of Renamo. But none of these European nations have suggested to deploy troops there. Why? Because they don't have interest there. Angola underwent a blood civil war after its independence. And who was funded UNITA was Portugal. Portugal is an European nation. And none of these, the European Union or even the United Nations talked about sending troops to stop the war in Angola. At one time, South African begged apartheid intervened to support UNITA, but none of these European nations raised a question or even tried to assist. At one time, UNITA's military prowess was more powerful than MPLA-led government. And if were it not for Cuba, Luanda would have fallen. And these European nations, they didn't see any problems with that. To them, it was all fine when Africans were butchering each other because their interests were not served. The Democratic Republic of War has never known peace. The Democratic Republic of War, former Zaire, has got 90 minerals of economic interest. The reason why it has been never known peace,
Simon,
is because
Saxon,
yes.
Saxon, you have 2 minutes to summarize.
Okay. The Democratic Republic has never known
2 minutes to summarize your speech, okay. Make your points, and we thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
The DRC war was supported by Belgium and the CIA, which actually imposed Mobutu Sese Seko. And when Mobutu Sese Seko was deposed, the Southern African nations supported Laurent Desire Kabila, and some of these nations like Zimbabwe paid dearly for affecting the European interest in the DRC. And after the intervention of nations like Zimbabwe, the United Kingdom sided, the US sided the UK in the bilateral conflict, resulting in the imposition of sanctions on military establishment of the Zimbabwean government because they'd affected their European and American interests. Rwanda genocide in 1994, the same European nations never paid interest when Africans were butchering each other because their interests were not served. So the issue of military interventions in Africa by Europeans doesn't serve our interests, but promotes and perpetuates their hegemony. And after their military intervention, they come in with these NGOs, which are meant to perpetuate and protect their interests, thereby fostering policies meant to ensure their continued looting to enhance their economic hegemony. I submit.
Saxon Zvina, all the way from Harare, Zimbabwe, for that presentation. Next, I'll welcome Dr. David Matsanga, who in return will bring us the next speaker, Simone Ekpa. Dr. David Matsanga.
Thank you. Thank you very much, participants across the world, wherever you are in Africa, from West Africa in Banjul, to East Africa in Asmara, North Africa in Cairo, South Africa in Cape Town, Central Africa in Kigali. Thank you very much for watching us. Thank you very much for listening to our show this morning. I hope we are still in the morning session. Afternoon, morning. What is the time? It's noon. Thank you very much. Now, there are 2 points that I want to make clear and to bring you back to the topic. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba raised a number of things. It looked like he changed the program, the question to us Africans. Am I wrong, Prof? You changed the question to us. And I want the next speakers to answer those questions. Is it us who are the problem? Is the problem on the continent of Africa, or it is a continent which is a package that comes from France? There, I and the professor, we shall struggle on it in the afternoon again. I will be on a different side. I don't want to tell you, but I want other people to convince me that this problem is an African problem. It is us Africans who cause this problem. And we are part and parcel to blame. It is us who always become conduits of this war. It is us who call these guys to come in. Do we have the will to manufacture a toothpick? How many African countries manufacture toothpicks? But our trees are cut in Garamba Park, in Mabira Forest, and you see trucks and trucks of timber going to China for China to make toothpicks. And then we see women and men loaded in Kenya Airways, Uganda Airways, Qatar, Emirates, Air China, going to buy toothpicks and bring them back to sell them to us. So where is the problem, Prof? We want the speakers to focus. The problem of Mozambique is narcotics. And the President Nyusi, we are putting you on notice. This is not this is not going to be a honeymoon for you to hide under SADC and not to be told that you are part of the problem that caused the war in Cape Delgado. Yes. Yes. Why was this war not there when Chisano was there? Hey, that's why we need Chisano later on this afternoon. Frelimo is a party created, supported by Africa. As I bring in my next speaker, I want to thank both speakers, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, for significantly bringing in the aspect of our problem. In some African countries, we are told we have to have election every 5 years. Do you have the money to hold the election every 5 years? And you go on borrowing this money. You are borrowing the money every time to do an election. Then when you cheat it, they come to say you borrowed our money and we want accountability. You say, no, this is my election. This is my country. This is my what? Have you seen the problem we have? Professor brought it on table. This is the 21st century. Some African countries are telling people, instead of giving them technology, they are giving them all the Stone Age equipment. Oh, yeah. What a show today. Prof, you brought something. There's something you spoke that touched my heart. This stone equipment of creating fire, of rubbing a stone on a stone, when we have already moved. This is the poverty of faith we have on the continent of Africa. The arbitrary dictatorial tendencies of leaders in Africa. You talked of leaders gathering in African Union, Prof. Buhari also calls himself a leader. He gathers in African Union. When younger girls in Nigeria are being abducted every day, why don't you sit home like a Pombe Magufuli? The late did not attend these stupid things of AU, UN. Hey, Africa, we want to talk. Now, Saxon dealt with a background of colonial mentality. I want to keep you up to date with the debate. As Simone comes in, Simone Ekpa. Ekpa is a Biafran. He's a Biafran who struggles for independence of a Biafran state. Our work here is to listen, to talk to every African, as long as you are not a terrorist. Because we don't talk to terrorists. And we don't want people to label others terrorists because they want to have power. Don't label people terrorists because they have disagreed with you on opinion. You label Al-Shabaab terrorists because they have a uniform from Saudi Arabia. But you don't even condemn Saudi Arabia. Did they steal the uniform from Saudi Arabia? They come and use the same uniform to maim us in Nairobi and Kampala. And then you keep on saying, I'm an African, climbing an Airbus plane going to London. I'm an African head of union. I am an African, Paris. I am an African going to Germany to go and discuss. Why don't you ask questions? Why is Al-Shabaab wearing a uniform similar to Saudi Arabian army? Who gives them the uniform? Why are you not asking Saudi Arabia? How did the uniform that Al-Shabaab wears reach Mogadishu to disturb Farimajo's government? Today I'm on the side of Farimajo, unfortunately. Yeah? Yes, Nigeria is falling ship, sinking ship. A country with 200 million people with nothing to show in Africa, only Hollywood movies. Wow. What a shame. My next speaker comes from that country. He's a Biafran. And if there is anybody who wants to counter him, the Nigerian embassy, you are listening. Wherever you are, come out. Don't operate underground. Come and we talk. Nigeria's problem is political, not judicial. You will not solve that problem judiciary, in a judicial manner, sorry. You must solve it politically. Huh. My Africa, welcome Simone Ekpa. Simone Ekpa lives in Finland. He's a Biafran. His views are for Biafra and for the people of Africa. The question at hand today, EU, the conflict it supports on Africa or tries to prevent on Africa. Do they manufacture them for their interest or for the interest of Africans? That's the question. And the PLO answered it very well. We collect AK-47, we buy them. Small arms must be sold for the metros and the trains to work in Paris. Paris. Do you know that 3/4 of Africa is destabilized by Paris? Are you ashamed that after Afghanistan, the United States of America wants to offload gun, some conflict in Indian Ocean again, near Palma? What is Palma? The center of narcotics. Thank you very much, President Uhuru Kenyatta, for blowing a ship that came from Palma. Woohoo! Don't you see that? Very interesting. When the President Uhuru Kenyatta blew the ship on the sea in Mombasa, where I am, the world condemned him. Some people condemned him, you saw. But we people who have been fighting drugs against narcotics. But where was the narcotics coming from? Afghanistan. Where was it being offloaded? Palma. Why is Mozambique a conduit of narcotics? Wait for my paper this afternoon. Hallelujah, walai. It has to come out. For now, I call upon Simon to give us his views. Simon, Ekpa. Thank you very much. I can see you are wearing the real African. Yes.
Thank you.
Simon, you are wearing the real African attire of Kingdom of Africa. I love Biafrans. I've loved them, I've supported them since 1967. I supported them. My father was a good supporter. My president, Dr. Milton Obote, was a good supporter. I love Biafrans. Nyerere, my man, the mentor I follow, and whom Professor PLO here follows, loved Biafra. Kaunda, who went away a few days ago, loves Biafra. They were the first people who stood up and said, recognize Biafra. My father took me to that conference when I was a younger man and said, come to Kampala while you stay at your uncle's place in a place called Naguru, while we go for the conference in Speak Hotel. And I kept on saying, what is this problem that my father wants me to see? I did not know he was telling me, you will one day stand up for 6 good years, free, voluntarily, defend what my father started together with others. I call upon Simon, you have 35 minutes, take it away to 45 minutes. Bring us to perspective. Welcome, Simon, on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matsanga, for this wonderful opportunity given to me today to be part of this conference. I greet you. I thank you for setting up this particular conference where we will discuss issues affecting Africa as a whole. I also thank Professor Lumumba for always being there for Africa as a Pan-African. I also thank him for the fact that he is now speaking the same language with us, and I really appreciate him for that. Also, welcome our viewers. Professor Lumumba has said a lot of things that I wanted to point out, and on that note, it is going to be a lesser problem for me. Professor Lumumba have pointed out a lot of things, including why have we ever wondered why the leaders in Africa are always going to some place to pay homage and get directive from them. Of course, this same question he has answered. I will also address it from my own perspective and from my own context. What is the problem of Africa? The topic today, as you said, is EU deployment in Africa conflict zone for political stability or for their own economic stability. First of all, the problem with Africa, especially the African leaders and Africans, is that when we take one step forward, we take 10 steps backward. What do I mean by this? I mean that when Africa take one step forward, they take 10 steps backward. We remember the history of Kenya, the history of Uhuru Kenyatta. Uhuru Kenyatta's father, when he was being persecuted for fighting for freedom of his people, Biafrans, and a Biafran leader in the name of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe gave him protection in Biafra land. We Biafra people, we stand very tall to protect the father of Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya today. That was a step forward. That was a step forward to serve humanity, respect for freedom, respect for self-determination. That was so many years ago. Today, in 2020, in 2021, Uhuru Kenyatta has paid that same Biafra with 20 steps backward. That is what I can say is the problem of Africa. Our leader, the leader of indigenous people of Biafra, were abducted in Kenya by the Nigerian government, kidnapped, taken to a private apartment in Kenya with the help of the Kenya authorities, police. Instead of Uhuru Kenyatta to offer something that Biafra people offer to his father, he betrayed Biafra. That is 20 steps backward. And I am calling on Kenyans today to know this fact before I go forward into making my presentation, that we are demanding Kenya to step up and make sure that our leader who was abducted in Kenya will be repatriated back to Kenya or where he come from. It is a breach of Kenya law. It is a breach of Kenya constitution. It was a breach of Kenya sovereignty, and the Kenya people must not allow this to happen, and they must not keep quiet. Nigeria cannot come into Kenya and abduct somebody from a different country, and you are all keeping quiet. So I'm calling on Uhuru Kenyatta to remember that Biafra people that he allowed Nigeria to kidnap today, we also offer the same help to his father. And as a result of the help we offer to his father, that is the reason why Kenya is as it is today. Kenya were able to be a better country today because of the selfless service, because of the sacrifice of the Uhuru Kenyatta's father, of which Nnamdi Azikiwe, a Biafran, and Biafra people were part and parcel of that sacrifice. Now, going further, whether this European invasion or presence in Africa is for us, is for Africa people, I will want to say this. I also thank Professor Lumumba for the fact that he acknowledged and agreed that in Africa, especially in Nigeria, we have a dangerous diversity that must be dismantled for us to move forward and progress. Some of you do not understand how life works. For us to have a better life, for us to have a better and secure society, we need to undergo a very rigorous and tough process. Very tough process. I want to tell you that for a diamond to be formed, it has to undergo about 2000 to 2002 degree of heat, of temperature, to be able to form and become diamond. This is also a principle of life. For the world today, let me tell you one thing. The life we live in today, this global village, the Western world, the America, the Asia, that everybody is enjoying today, had undergone over 2000 degrees of temperature to become what it is. The European that are sending or deploying some troop in Africa for stability has also undergone 2000 degrees of heat to be able to become stable, to have the opportunity and the possibility to begin to send troops to Africa. How were they able to become this stable? They undergo wars. They went through wars. Let me now give a little bit illustration to this. For example, somebody who were giving birth in 1900, if you are giving birth in 1900, the process of the world becoming a diamond started in 1914. The World War First begins in 1914. So if you are born, or if you were born in 1900, at age of 14, you already witnessed the First World War. As the world continued to undergo the process of this 2200 degrees to become diamonds, when you become the age of 18, over 22 million people were dead as a result of the First World War. As time goes by, shortly after that, you had what we call the Spanish pandemic. The Spanish pandemic killed over 50 million people. This same corona you see today, we have had it. All these things are part of design for the world and the globe